Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bed crimers. As always, I wish you the best. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. Let me just ask that after listening to or watching this video, if you learned something or enjoyed it, please do me a favor and smash that like button. Now, let's dig in. Well, hello, BCS Nation. I'm sort of stealing the Surviving the Survivor STS Nation thing. Like it. Today, I want to talk once more about possible connections between serialist Ted Bundy and Bryan Kohberger. If the Moscow police are right, and Kohberger turns out to be the perpetrator of the brutal crime at 1122 King Road, he will be studied for years to come. And the biggest questions of all will be, what led him to conceive of and carry out such a violent crime against these particular victims? And where did all the rage that fueled the crime come from? The 30 murders that Ted Bundy confessed to were as gruesome as the ones that occurred in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. Bundy's rage was as extreme as it gets. Thus, I thought it would be interesting to look at Bundy's life and the factors that many believe contributed to him likely developing an antisocial personality disorder and that may have prompted his rage-fueled attacks against pretty women. Maybe Bundy's background and experiences can shed light on what could have prompted Bryan Kohberger, if he is found guilty of the crime. He is presumed innocent at this time, to take the lives of Kaylee Goncalves, Maddie Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, and do it in such an intimate, butcherous manner. According to Wiktionary.org, that is a word. Butcherous. Bundy started out life on somewhat shaky ground. He was born on November 24th, 1946, to an unwed 22-year-old named Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Maternity Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. Eleanor, who went by Louise, intended to leave baby Theodore at the home, but her father insisted that she go back and bring the baby home. Because of the stigma society attached at the time to unwed mothers and their offspring, who were referred to as illegitimate and even worse terms, it was decided that young Ted would be raised by his maternal grandparents. And for much of his young life, he believed that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his much older sister. By the way, Ted's biological father was not identified on his birth certificate, and some experts think that Ted's grandfather, who is believed to have been abusive, may actually have been his dad. Cringe. Big cringe. Bundy finally found out the truth about who his mother was when he was a teenager and someone showed him his birth certificate. The shocking revelation led to much resentment against Louise. Ted reportedly felt very angry about the confusion this situation caused him, and also for being estranged from his biological father. In her book, The Stranger Beside Me, author Anne Rule, who knew Bundy and considered him a friend, described working at a crisis hotline alongside him. Bundy was in college at the time. She confirmed that Ted told her he grew up thinking his mom was his sister and that his grandparents were his parents, and he also described himself as illegitimate. You have to wonder how being deemed illegitimate made him feel about himself. Did it set him off on a path of insecurity? I also wonder if on a deep psychological level, he felt either rejected by the biological father he never knew or abandoned by him somehow. I believe even little babies feel on some very deep psychic level the loss of a parent, and it usually affects them for a lifetime. It was in 1951 that a very young Ted and his mother, Louise, left Vermont and moved to the working-class city of Tacoma, Washington. There, Louise soon met a man named Johnny Bundy. Johnny and Louise fell in love and were married that same year. Johnny Bundy adopted Ted, and Ted would go on to become a big brother to 3 other children that Johnny and Louise had together, 2 sisters and a brother. According to biography.com, Ted resented his stepfather for being uneducated and working class, and yet a woman who appeared in the Netflix docuseries called The Ted Bundy Tapes and who lived near the Bundys as a child said that Ted's parents and the family were pretty much like the Cleavers in Leave It to Beaver, and both Johnny and Louise were very good parents and very involved. Thus, Bundy didn't have an evil stepfather who hurt him, and if he was abused by anyone, it sounds like it would have been his grandfather back in Vermont. In recorded interviews Bundy agreed to make with 2 journalists in 1980 at the Florida State Prison after he was convicted in 1979 for the deaths of the 2 Florida State University sorority sisters, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, Bundy painted his childhood as the perfect boyhood experience. And perhaps some of this was true. He had 2 good parents. He did get to play in the woods near his home. It was very green and lush. He did catch bullfrogs with the other little boys. But according to that lady who grew up in the same neighborhood, Bundy's younger years were not all rosy and perfect. She said that she and Ted grew up in a neighborhood where there were either well-to-do families or not well-to-do families. And per this lady, Bundy's family was among the have-nots. Ted's stepfather was an Army hospital cook, and his mother worked as a secretary to help make ends meet. So there wasn't a lot of money in the Bundy household. We weren't dealing here with educated parents who went to Ivy League schools. These were working class people, salt of the earth kind of folk. This too reminds me of things that have been reported about Bryan Kohberger's family. Kohberger's father, Michael, worked in the local school district as a handyman or a maintenance man, and his mother, Marianne, was a teacher's aide in the same school district. It's also been reported that the Kohbergers went bankrupt twice. Once when Bryan was a small child, and possibly a second time when he was in middle or high school. This makes it sound like money was problematic for the Kohbergers as well. And I'm sure that if the family did go through a second bankruptcy when Bryan was a teenager, it had to have been somewhat traumatic. In fact, the rumors were that the family almost lost their home. Imagine how scary that would be for a child, even a teenager, the fear of being out on the street. It can also be embarrassing to go through something like that, especially if the neighbors and your friends catch wind of it. And while the home the Kohbergers currently inhabit in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, is in a gated community and to me looks large and quite nice, it doesn't sound like the family is living large. When Kohberger's sister recently lost her job, reportedly because of her connection to her brother, it was said that the family was having a hard time financially. Back to Bundy. So this lady who grew up in the same neighborhood as Ted said that as a child, he was teased a lot for what she described as a horrible speech impediment. So here we have Bundy being teased and made to feel inadequate by his peers for this speech impediment that he can't help having. She also described Ted as being different from the other kids, even at this young age. She explained that in Cub Scouts, Ted never really fit in. She said he could never quite get the hang of things and do what the other kids were able to do so easily, such as learn how to tie knots the right way. win races, or shoot a rifle well. I guess they let kids shoot rifles back in the day at camp. I don't know. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. The picture this neighborhood girl, now lady, painted of a young Ted Bundy was of an intelligent boy, but not an athletic one or a coordinated one. And there's a photo of Ted standing with the other boys at camp, and his demeanor seems so different from the other boys. His shoulders are way up high, and he just doesn't look at ease. This lady also stated that Bundy had a temper as a kid, and he liked to scare people. She described him building what she called tiger traps in the woods. He would dig a big pit in the ground, put sharp branches in it upright, then cover it all up with foliage, and wait for some unfortunate kid to fall in. And sure enough, a little girl fell in one day and ended up getting her legs sliced open from a pointy branch. Is that normal kid shenanigans, or was Bundy already sort of dark? And in high school, this lady said Bundy announced that he was going to be president one day. I wonder if he was trying to cover up his sense of inadequacy with this boasting. In the recorded chats with the reporters in Florida, Bundy, as an adult, described himself as being one of the boys in high school, as in belonging to the popular group of guys. He also told the reporters that he was in the ski club and was friends with all the football players, but the neighborhood lady said none of that was true, that Bundy was lying to the reporters and trying to fool them into viewing him as a popular high schooler when he was actually something of a loner and an outcast who spent most of his time alone. Bundy did admit to the reporters, though, that he never went to school dances, didn't participate in parties, didn't go out drinking, and he never pursued any girls because he didn't know how to. This lady said that she felt bad for him back then because he was a good-looking young guy, but he didn't seem to be all there. She described it as him having some gap that set him apart. This certainly sounds a lot like how high school friends of Bryan Kohberger describe him being back in the day. We've heard how he wanted to date a cute blonde cheerleader, and he even sent her love letters, and it was all to no avail. And rather than getting a date, he got bullied and teased. We also heard how he lost 100 pounds, but was still unable to achieve any degree of popularity or get any attention from the pretty girls he coveted. And then there was a male classmate of Kohberger's at Washington State University who said that Bryan boasted one time that he could go into any bar in Pullman and get any chick he wanted. Remember that? Sounds more like wishful thinking, much like the tale Bundy was trying to spin about his happy childhood and high school years. It was when Bundy attended the University of Washington that he had his first romantic relationship. There, in the spring of 1967, he met classmate Diane Edwards. And according to his friend Ann Rule, in Diane Edwards, Bundy, quote, saw a woman who was the epitome of his dreams. Edwards was like no girl he had ever seen before, and he considered her the most sophisticated, the most beautiful creature possible. End quote. Diane came from a wealthy family in California, and she represented what Bundy aspired to, namely the wealthy upper crust. By the way, Diane Edwards was a slim, white female with long dark hair, and this turned out to be Bundy's preferred type later on when he trawled for victims. Most of the women he did in were slender brunettes with long hair and pretty faces. At first, Bundy was afraid to ask Edwards out because she apparently preferred jocks. But he would later say that they eventually bonded over their mutual love of skiing. Who knew Bundy was a skier? It's hard to picture him doing normal activities when he's so well known for being a murderer? It wasn't long before Ted and Diane fell in love, and Anne Rule believes Bundy lost his virginity to Edward. This could be why Bundy would later say that the relationship he had with Diane had a lasting impact on him. You never forget your first love, right? But Bundy had apparently fallen harder for Diane than she for him. According to Anne Rule, this was because Diane sensed that Ted was foundering at school and that he had no real plans for the future. Also, he wasn't from the same background. While attending college, Ted had to work a variety of menial, low-paying jobs to cover his expenses. It also bothered Diane that he wasn't sure what his major should be. This was not the type of guy she envisioned herself with in the future. Anne Rule also wrote that Edwards found Bundy, quote, very emotional and unsure of himself. But more than that, she had a niggling suspicion that he used people, that he would become close to people who might do favors for him, and that he took advantage of them, end quote. And while Diane was sort of analyzing Ted to decide if he was husband material, Bundy was experiencing major insecurities. He said, quote, "There were occasions when I felt that she expected a great deal more from me than I was really capable of giving. I was not in any position to take her out and squire her around in the manner she was accustomed to or buy her clothing," end quote. When Edwards graduated from the University of Washington in 1968, she moved to San Francisco for a job. Suddenly, she and Bundy found themselves in a long-distance relationship. As time went on, Edwards' letters and calls to Bundy became less frequent. Bundy, ever enamored, grew fearful about what Diane was doing in her spare time. Later that year, Diane dumped Ted, and he was, as you can imagine, devastated. He said of this experience, "I had this overwhelming sense of rejection." And he would later admit that it was at this point that he began to desire some sort of revenge against Diane. Many experts who studied Bundy in an attempt to understand why he went on to brutally murder all those strangers have theorized that several factors led to his violent killing spree. One, that he had a lot of unresolved anger from his messed up childhood. Although Bundy says in the tapes that he had no major feelings about the revelation that his mother lied about who she was and he would never know his real father, his prison psychologist, Dr. Al Carlisle, believed all of this affected him greatly. And two, the pain of the breakup with Diane Edwards and that overwhelming sense of rejection he felt. Note that after the breakup, Ted decided he was going to change himself to become the kind of man that the world and Diane Edwards would view as a success. Bundy said, "She inspired me to look at myself and become something more." At the time Diane broke up with Ted, he was no longer enrolled in college. But after the breakup, he re-enrolled at the University of Washington, and he finally picked out a major, psychology. Here's another parallel with Bryan Kohberger. He also studied psychology for his undergraduate degree. As he was attending college, Bundy met another young woman. Her name was Elizabeth Kohberger, and she soon became his longtime girlfriend. 2 years after his breakup with Diane Edwards in 1970, Bundy was hailed as a hero by the Seattle Police Department when he reportedly saved a 3-year-old from drowning. Does this also ring a bell? We know Bryan Kohberger, too, was hailed a hero for helping save a coworker's life when he was working as a security guard in the school district where he attended school. Strange that both Bundy and Kohberger who were and are accused of taking lives were at one time credited with saving a life. Note that even as Bundy went on to complete his undergraduate degree and have this new relationship with Elizabeth, he remained obsessed with Diane Edwards. According to Anne Rule, in 1972, Bundy confided in her that he was still in love with Diane despite their breakup 4 years earlier and despite him being involved with Elizabeth. Bundy also told Anne Rule that Diane was the only woman he ever really loved. Ted then asked Anne if she thought Diane might love him again if he sent her a dozen red roses. Seems like a very odd question. What guy thinks that after 4 years, a dozen red roses is going to make his old flame who broke up with him suddenly want to get back together? Well, guess what? Somehow Bundy did manage to reconnect with Edwards. In 1973, 5 years after the breakup, Bundy spent a few days with her in California. He'd gone there on a business trip and called her up. They agreed to meet for dinner, and Diane was amazed at how much Ted had changed since she last saw him. By this point, he'd obtained his degree in psychology, and he'd been accepted into law school. Diane actually was wooed by this new Ted, and soon they were a couple again. That guy had to have some mad charm. Diane even flew out to Seattle to visit him. What Bundy had failed to mention was that he had a girlfriend there. But somehow he managed to hide this little detail as he wined and dined Diane. The two even talked about their wedding plans. Diane was suddenly convinced that she and Ted were going to be married within the year. And after Christmas, Diane flew back to Seattle to see Ted yet again. But this time he was cold and distant, and when she brought up their wedding plans, he was utterly evasive. Diane thought they were engaged, and now here he was acting completely disinterested and unaware. Diane went home to San Francisco deeply disappointed and wrote Ted a note asking him what happened, but he didn't write back. By mid-February, Diane was, as they say, pissed off and irate, so she called him and she let him have it for his bizarre behavior. During the call, Bundy's voice was flat and calm as he said to her, quote, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean." And then Bundy hung up. I think this is what is now called gaslighting. He gaslit her big time. The truth was that Bundy had gone to all these great lengths to win her over, but all of it had been an evil ruse to get back at her so that he could then hurt her for breaking up with him all those years earlier. Diane Edwards, you dodged the biggest bullet ever. Can you imagine how her mind had to have been blown by his behavior? Girl must have needed some heavy-duty therapy after having her head and her heart messed with. But the story illustrates how Bundy dealt with his emotions. Instead of taking the breakup in stride and learning from it, he was out for blood and revenge. It's amazing he didn't take Diane Edwards' life. Now, it was during that same year, 1974, the year of revenge on Diane Edwards, that Bundy started committing his first documented attacks on women. Note that I said documented. It's possible that he began harming people much earlier in life. Whatever happened with Diane Edwards seemed to have propelled Bundy into full attack mode. He promptly dropped out of law school, so instead of focusing on continuing to better himself, Bundy threw all his plans aside and let his inner monster out of the cage. In January, Bundy broke into an 18-year-old University of Washington student's bedroom, and he attacked her as she was sleeping. He used a metal rod from her bed frame to carry out the vicious crime. It sounds like Bundy's preferred weapons were items he picked up either outside the homes or inside. Remember, he would later use a piece of firewood or a wood club of some sort to attack those co-eds in Florida. Now, this 18-year-old in Washington state survived, thankfully, but the beating was so brutal that it left her with permanent disabilities. Do not be drawn in by that Ted Bundy smile. He was as evil as it gets. By February, Bundy had broken into another college student's apartment, that of Linda Ann Healy. This time, he abducted his victim and killed her. Healy had been a popular weather person and ski report person for a local radio station, which makes me wonder if that's how Bundy came to be aware of her. Did he see her on TV? Did he listen to her on the radio? By the middle of 1974, college students in the Tacoma, Washington area were vanishing nearly at the rate of one a month. From January to July of that year, Bundy is believed to have done in 8 women, all in their early 20s, and all with long dark hair parted in the middle, like Diane Edwards. If the Moscow police have the right guy, let's hope the prosecutor and his team have all their ducks in a row, because anyone capable of doing what was done to those 4 precious students, Ethan, Xana, Maddie, and Kaylee, would most likely go on to do more of the same. It is a terrifying thought. Would the perpetrator have trawled for more pretty blonde college students on which to vent his rage? I'm hoping that we will never know, because that will mean he is either locked away for life in a maximum security prison cell or put away for good by another, more permanent method. I'm not for indiscriminately putting accused criminals to death, but in this case, it seems like a just punishment. But again, Kohberger must have his day in court, and anyone picked to be on that jury, if there is a trial, must base their judgment not on our musings in the true crime community, but rather on the evidence presented in court during the trial. And that can be done. You can hear about a crime, you can have ideas about it, but you can still go into a courtroom, put all of that stuff aside, and focus on the job at hand, giving the person a fair trial, basing your judgment only on what is presented in that courtroom. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories, hey, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to my channel, consider a membership, and if you like downloading episodes, you can go over to Spotify and you can find me under the name Carnage Street. And if you like what you hear over there, then do me a favor there and leave me a review there as well.